Hi, and welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. Today my guest is Bob Walter, Executive Director and Board President of the Joseph Campbell Foundation. Bob was Campbell's editor for the last 10 years of his life, and the editorial director of the Historical Atlas of World Mythology. Following Joseph Campbell's death in 1987, he served as literary executor of Campbell's estate, and continues to oversee the publication of Joseph Campbell's writings. We got a chance to talk about the work and the life of a man who was a central figure in Esalen's history, as well as the human potential movement. And amidst this, I got the chance to play some original Joseph Campbell clips taken from a speech he gave at the Esalen Institute on October 12, 1967, entitled Freud, Jung, and Kundalini Yoga. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation with Bob Walter. Bob Walter, thank you so much for joining us on Voices of Esalen.
My pleasure, Sam.
I have kind of an interesting thing, an additional media piece for our interview today. I have a talk that Joseph Campbell gave in, I think, 1967 at the Esalen Institute, and I cut up a couple of clips that I thought I might intersperse into our conversation just to spur discussion, and perhaps it'll provide interesting, fodder for discussion, and maybe it won't. I don't know.
Nothing ventured, nothing gained.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I thought it might be useful for you, if it was possible, to kind of give an overview for those of us who aren't as familiar with Joseph Campbell's work. If you could outline some of the main pieces of his philosophy and who he was.
Well, let me try to do that, but let me, I could do a full hour and a half just on that. So let me give you some highlights, but also put it in the context of where we are. Joe, one of his last talks, actually, we were just listening to it the other day, was at Skowhegan, and it was sort of about how I became a writer. And in the early on in the 40s, he had been studying in Europe. He'd gone to Sylvia Beach's Shakespeare and Company bookstore, and Ulysses by James Joyce had just been published. And she gave him a copy, and he took it away, and he was completely baffled. He didn't know what to make of it or how to read it. Then he went back to talk to Sylvia Beach, and she gave him a whole other stack of books and said, well, read these, and you'll be able to read that. So he dove deep into Ulysses. And then, as Joyce's Finnegan's Wake was coming out, which was serialized in its initial publication, it was baffling to many, many people. And he struck up a friendship with Henry Morton Robinson, known as Rondo. Rondo had written The Cardinal, a novel that was fairly big at that time. And together they decided to write what they called a skeleton key to Finnegan's Wake. So it began to tell you how to read or encounter this work. That was one of his first pieces. And then around that time, the Bollingen Foundation was being started. Now, Bollingen was started by Mary Mellon, the wife of Paul Mellon, and she'd been in Europe studying with Jung. And so the Bollingen Foundation initially was supposed to be set up as a sort of publishing arm to bring Jung's works to the U.S. and publish them in English. That was parenthetically an endeavor that didn't really end until about 8 years ago. It went on and on and on and on. And so the Bollingen Foundation early on, one of their first things was, their first book was called Where the Two Came to Their Father. And what it was a Navajo sand painting, a compendium of Navajo sand paintings that told this story of where the two came to their father. Maud Oakes, the anthropologist, had interviewed a Native American elder named Jeff King, and they through these 6 of plates. And the plates were about the size of this table in front of us, which is like 2 feet by 3 foot. They were published in a big folio. And then there was a commentary by Joseph Campbell, which was almost a small panel. Through this time, he'd been working on what was known as different names at one time. It was called History of the Gods, but it ultimately became known as The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And it was published 1948-49 by Bollingen, and arguably is the the most well-known of his works, and certainly the one that's had some of the largest influence. It was very, very popular in certain circles. Mostly, Joe lived his whole life in a 2-room apartment in Greenwich Village. He traveled with his wife, Jean Erdman, who was a dancer with the likes of, collaborated with John Cage and Merce Cunningham and Eric Hawkins and all of these, and then a lot of the abstract expressionists. And In fact, shortly after we started the foundation, there was a big event in Arkansas, a teacher training, but also an exhibit. And I was asked to come down and talk, and I didn't know why they wanted me to talk about the hero. It emerged that this young professor at the University of Florida was writing a book called Abstract Expressionism and the American Experience. And so he started going around to all of these different studios of these artists, and quickly he noticed that every one of them had on their shelf a well-thumbed copy of The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And so suddenly these seeming abstract drawings of things like crossing the threshold and meeting the goddess, and these titles, where did they come from? Well, they came from Hero. And so there was this art exhibit of about 40 or 50 major pieces of art, all with these titles that came from the Hero. In the 60s then, Joe's work was rumbling again around through certain circles, and so when Dick Price and Michael started thinking about what they were going to do here, one of the first people they wanted to bring in, almost as a consultant or bring on, was Joe, and so he came here, and it was a funny kind of juxtaposition because, in one sense, human potential and the focus on body work, which is developed here, and all of that. Well, to bring in at that point a person who'd been teaching for 40 years, and it's Sarah Lawrence teaching girls comparative religion and mythology, and it was a bit of a stretch, and it went on for a while. I mean, there's stories of people flocking to hear him lecture, and other people coming in, and wanting to do yoga or wanting to move or whatever, and this guy's just talking at them.
Yeah.
As he was here, certainly in the late 60s, by the time he started coming every year, people would come up to him and say, "Oh, I'm so glad I found The Hero with a Thousand Faces because I was having this. I was really lost. I was on this altered consciousness state, and I didn't know where I was. And then somebody gave me this book, and it was kind of a guide map. And he would say, I don't know anything about that, because he was, in one sense, pretty straight-laced, and came here to Esalen. I think it was probably 4 years before he took off his tie. But he would say, I didn't know what went on in the 60s, but I knew something happened because suddenly my royalties for Hero with a Thousand Faces had an extra zero in it. And that's how he knew. Then he came into the 70s, and he fell out of fashion. He still came out here. He did a West Coast tour, he did UC Extension and Esalen and so on. But he was increasingly a prophet without honor on the East Coast. Paradoxically, at the same time, it was the same time that George Lucas had discovered Hero with a Thousand Faces, and was later to say, that it's quite likely he would not have been able to write Star Wars if he hadn't found this book, because he had this space opera in his head, but he didn't have a structure. And slowly that the Hero started popping up particularly in cinema and in the emerging field of video games, and early role-playing card games, Dungeons and Dragons and things like this. This was all going on in the 70s, but at the same time, he was a prophet without honor. No one would publish him. And he'd been working on this magnum opus called the Historical Atlas of World Mythology, which was going to be 1 volume, and then 2 volumes, and then 4 volumes, and then 4 volumes in multiple parts. Well, we ended up starting a publishing company in the late 70s, early 80s, because no one would publish him. And so we, mortgaged our houses, and we started a publishing company. And we managed to bring out a hunk of the Atlas, and then the publishing company published a lot of other stuff in art and photography and cultural history. But the real reason for beginning it was we had this book that we had all our livelihoods invested in that was growing and growing and growing, and we couldn't publish it. And then we determined we'd publish it, we couldn't get anybody to distribute it. And so this was the situation in the early to the mid-'80s. The Atlas came out, suddenly people got really interested again. Around the same time, Chris Vogler, who wrote a book called The Writer's Journey, which is taking the hero's journey of Campbell and applying it to scripts. And so Chris was a writer, a script reader, head script reader, I think, at Universal Studios. He wrote a memo, about a 14-page memo that started circulating about how you read a script, how you look at a script, and you determine whether it's going to make a good movie. And it was somewhat formulaic, like, if there isn't a go about a third of the way in and read a little bit around. If you don't see a call to adventure, don't read anymore. Go 2/3 of the way in, and if you don't see a return, don't read anymore. It became a book called The Writer's Journey. And suddenly, we saw this, this was starting to ferment, but Campbell was still, really sort of flying under the radar. And then in the early 80s, he had done a 2-part interview with Bill Moyers on Bill Moyers' journal. And his 2-part, which was unusual, it was 1-hour sections, but the conversation was so animated that it ended up being 2 sections. And this is, early on, we didn't have any of the means of transcription we do now. You literally could write in for a transcript, and you got a booklet. And they had 10,000 requests for transcripts, which was more than they'd had for any other person they'd had on the show. So as we were getting ready to launch this atlas and publish it, 2 things were happening. One, we were in a period of time when Carl Sagan had Cosmos, and we started to see these media tie-ins where you'd have a book, a TV series, or sort of mutual release kind of thing. And so in preparation for this, I went up to see Moyers was at CBS at the time, but I went to his former producer at NPR, the NPR franchise in New York, and I asked if I could borrow the tapes from these interviews, because one of the things they talked a lot about was what was in this first book we were bringing out. And we were going to be launching it at the American Booksellers Association, and Joe couldn't be there because he was here. Okay? He was doing his West Coast tour. And so I thought, well, if I can't have him, I can at least have a talking head. And so they gave me permission to edit it down to about a 10-minute loop, which we did. And in the course of this, we had a little conversation about what's Bill going to do? Is he going to stay at CBS? Is he going to come back to PBS? And there's a lot of buzz about this. And the message I got was, well, the one thing he knows is if he comes back, he doesn't want to just do talking heads again. He wants to do something that has scope and sweep. And I said, well, Campbell's doing this historical atlas of world mythology. That's sort of got a little bit of scope and sweep. It goes from early speciation up till today, and so then began this kind of dance, which went on for about a year of Joan Connor talking to Bill, my talking to Joe, and us trying to figure out how to get them together. And so Bill was still under contract to CBS, and so we formed a partnership. And all we did was say, look, when Joe comes from Hawaii, where he'd moved to the mainland, why don't you guys have a conversation? And I called George Lucas, and George said we could use Skywalker. And then the other partners brought in the equipment and stuff. And we just got them together, and they talked for a weekend. And they went away, and they had a great time, and they did it again about a year later, and then they did it again. And then we're now in 1987. Bill has announced, that he's going to come back to PBS. He's left CBS. But again, there's no formal program here. This is just these guys talking. And Joe came out, did the West Coast tour, did one more set of rounds with Bill Moyers at the American Museum of Natural History, where their very first conversations had been. And it went back to Hawaii and was diagnosed with esophageal cancer, underwent radiation treatments, and 6 weeks later was dead of a heart attack from the radiation. So it was just, it just came out of the blue. And so Bill fast-tracked this material, and he took the entire production fund they'd given him, and he put together a 6-hour program, which ended up being called Joseph Campbell and the Power of Myth with Bill Moyers, which when it was done, nobody wanted. I mean, the first time out, it was recounted to me that, the programming people at the NPR affiliates were going, you have a 6 hours of conversation with an 80-year-old mythologist. I mean, that's really sexy TV. It's really going to help us build a young audience, isn't it?
And yet, I mean, it seems that he was an incredibly compelling speaker. Part of what you were saying was that the writing was hard to publish, but it seems that from the recordings that we have and the popularity of him as a speaker, he took it to a whole nother level in that respect. Yeah, and the thing is that he published 20 books. I mean, it's not, but his scholarship was influenced a lot by Germanic writers. Mm-hmm.
and he was quite the writing craftsman, and so he really worked the prose, which means it got dense and longer sentences and subordinate clauses, and that's sort of not where popular writing was going, even though he was writing for a popular audience. Yeah. But as you pointed out, he was a very compelling speaker because he'd spent all those years in a classroom, and he could really read his audience. Sure. Okay, and he could really answer what they had to say. He would respond, from the heart, from the soul. Yeah. And this is especially true then in the questions and answers that came along, because they would be things he wouldn't normally think of or be working of, and he would respond honestly. So,
may I play a...
Oh, please.
Now, the great yoga that I want to speak about is the Kundalini. This is a late form of yoga that developed probably in the Gupta period and thereafter, perhaps 5th century A.D. The idea is of a coiled up serpent power. The word Kundalini means coiled up at the base of the spine, as though the serpent were biting its tail and not outward turned. And the goal of this yoga is to wake that serpent and bring it up the spine. And on the way up, there are 6 centers through which it goes until it reaches the crown of the head. So we have 7 centers, the base, and then the 6 on the way up. And at each stage, the entire psychological structure becomes transformed.
One of the other early things, which I didn't mention, but when he was starting out, there was an Indologist named Heinrich Zimmer. Zimmer was the first guy to really bring Eastern thought into the West. And he came from Germany to give a series of guest lectures at Columbia. First lecture, there were like 3 people in the audience. Joe Campbell was one of them. And about the 3rd or 4th lecture, it had grown in size, the number of people, and he died. He got a cold and he died. And his widow asked Joe to take a look at his notes and see what could happen. So 4-5 volumes Joe published, ostensibly Heinrich Zimmer's work, but edited by Campbell. And he would talk about the fact that when I began working with him, and he would often say, "Do you have any questions?" And I frequently didn't. And he'd say, when I was working with Zimmer, Zimmer's material, all I kept thinking is, I wish I could have asked him this. And he said, sometimes I did. When I didn't know quite where I'm going, I asked him. I mean, because he's dead at that point. But Joe said he'd always thought that, he wished he'd had that opportunity. Mm-hmm. So he was deeply steeped in Hinduism particularly, but in Eastern traditions. And it's funny kind of because we're talking now early 40s. He became known as this scholar who was, as conversant in Eastern material as anybody, and he'd never gone there. And so it wasn't until 54, 55, he took a 1-year sabbatical and traveled. And he kept these journals, which we released initially as in 2 parts. The India journals we called Bakshish and Brahman, because he went there expecting to have philosophical conversations in India about Brahman and enlightenment and Kundalini and so on. And all he encountered was post-war Japan and post-war India, the communists or the capitalists or who's going to, it was bakshish, pay me, pay me, pay me everywhere he went. And then he went to Japan. We termed that book Saki and Satori, because the same thing. He fell in love with Japan, but he went there thinking he's going to explore this whole idea of Satori, and he found that Japanese culture was really built around sake and tea ceremonies and geishas, and a very different shift. We just released those for the first time. We were able to put it in between one set of covers. It's a mighty doorstop, but it's called the Asian Journals. So it was years later, in other words, before he went there. And what's really phenomenal is you see him in this book wrestling with his philosophical perceptions that he had coming in and the reality that faces him on the ground. Yes. So he'll say things like, there's no hope for this country if they can't do something about these damn cows.
But is part of the power of what he did to weave together disparate strands of myth and compare the way that they are alike? It seemed like there was a great influence by the modernist masters like Picasso, Mann, James Joyce, leading him to theorize that mythologies are manifestation of humankind's universal need to explain myth, and he's drawing from so many places.
Yeah, not necessarily humankind's need to understand myth, but they need to understand, period.
Yes.
Okay? Who am I? Where am I? Why am I here? What's this universe about? Well, what's out there? What, all of what we think of now of myths are these kinds of metaphoric explanations of phenomenon that couldn't be described any other way. He very much, it was one of his, I think, things that was most of a gift, but it was also the thing that got him most in trouble. Nowadays, it's not so unusual for someone, say, to create their own field of study that brings together disparate things. It was just verboten, even as recent as the 70s and 80s, and so he would go and draw on anthropological evidence or archaeological evidence, and the social scientists would go, "What are you doing? You're a literature professor," and then he would start to opine on, trace out the sources of Buddhism or religions, and the
Yes.
the religious studies people would go, wait a minute, stick with the Odyssey, stick with the Iliad, stick with the literature, okay? And then he would joke, that it's my there's my faith in your mythology, so my belief system is faith, and it's a myth.
Yes.
But that held true in these disciplines too. They weren't, you weren't going to hear or accept an insight that didn't come from somebody in your own field, peer-reviewed journal.
Right.
And he didn't do that. He wrote for a broad audience, and he drew from a lot of sources. The one thing I want to emphasize, though, because I think it's a huge misunderstanding of Campbell's work. We touched briefly on these universal patterns that he was seeing and all. And that was the hero with 1,000 faces, for sure. Okay, the rest of his life, was trying to explain the differences. If these things are the same, if these are universal energies that manifest in humanity through time and through culture, why are they different? So, he wrote the 4 series Masks of God, and he tried to split the material, and he talked about Occidental mythology and Oriental mythology as opposites. Then he talked about primitive mythology and creative mythology being the modernists, okay, what he was seeing there. And he saw ties. He went to an early exhibit of Picasso in France, and there was these African masks, and there was this exhibit compared the masks and Picasso's work. So he was seeing these, but again, that was a dialectic that he exposed. It didn't work. So ultimately he tried a lot of different ways. In the mythic image, he tried to make distinctions based on the architecture and the image and where it appears, and where it's the same, and therefore, and where is it different and why is it different? That didn't work. So, the last thing he was involved on was Historical Atlas of World Mythology. And there he posited, that the two things that we use as sort of metrics to comprehend the similarities and differences are historical, where the culture is in its historical development. And there's different metrics you can use for that. He used the work of Leo Frobenius. And the other side of that is Atlas, okay? Because the one undeniable thing of mythologies that come down to us is an oral tradition, and it's fixed to the landscape. They're metaphors that draw on what's visible around you. So if you draw, like all of our major Western religions all come out of the Middle East. They come out of a desert culture, a nomadic culture, a culture of scarcity, okay? That's going to influence the stories. You're not going to find stories about the bountiful whale and the dolphins coming and the salmon returning. Those are not stories from the Sinai Desert, okay? Same thing. If you live in Japan and you read these, or hear these early Japanese tales, and then you live on the Pacific coast of the United States, there's so much similar images. Okay, it's the dolphins and the salmon run, and it's all stories that are tied to the sea and what the sea does. So even though it's different parts of the world, it's the geography around that you'd land the myth on, and you still see it like in the Caucasus. the mountains, that's Grandpa in the mountains. You can sort of see the silhouette. And, oh, there's an earthquake, he just turned over. And so the landscape is where the myths got grounded. That you'd take the young man out and you'd say, well, here's the tree where, and here's the stone where, and of course we don't have any of that right now. I mean, we're all in a sense nomads again. We're all hunters and gatherers, on this global planet. We're learning to adapt a different way to ground the myths, because we can't count, on the one hand, we can't count on the landscape being the same, but on the other hand, we can't count on it being different enough. Tokyo is New York, is Mexico City, is Buenos Aires, is, okay? The city is the city. Yeah. And even the, exurban areas tend to all sort of be the same. And so the tie to the land that used to ground the myths and ground the stories and ground our growing and our understanding is gone.
I want to ask you about the influence of Jung. I have a clip here from the same speech.
It is that point at the center of the turning wheel of time, or the turning wheel of the universe, where the opposites come together. You have what Jung calls the coincidence of opposites here. This is a main theme in his thinking. Desire and terror, or fear, or aggression come to an end here. They are extinguished. And the reason they are extinguished, and this is a very important point for the whole Oriental system, is that sense of ego has been wiped out. The key activity is egolessness.
What was the significance of Jung's thought on Campbell's work?
I don't know that we know that because of his editing the portable Jung, and at a later point he edited the papers from the Eranos yearbooks. People assumed that there was a very close relationship. There really wasn't. I mean, the hero mentions Jung, it mentions some others, but if you wanted, probably Freud was the most dominant figure in that book. Later, he went deeper into Jung when he did the portable Jung, because he had to read everything that had been published and then reduce it down. But same thing happened with the papers from the Eranos yearbooks, because Eranos was a conference, an annual conference, sort of, in some sense, much like the astrophysics conference that's going on here now, where a group of people were invited to sit around this table, and they were challenged to present material that was at the edge of their discipline, that they wouldn't necessarily submit for jury, but where they needed to voice it, to talk about it, to get pushback on it, to see what resonated with their peers and what didn't. And Joe observed, and he did one major paper there. He was invited to deliver it, called "The Symbol Without Meaning." But he was enough there, and had become enough of a presence that he was asked then to take these yearbooks. So, I mean, what that means is each year they published in a yearbook all of the papers that were presented. They weren't widely circulated. In fact, there was some sense that there's sometimes when the person didn't really want it circulated because they were working the ideas out. So they thought it would be really great doing the collected works of Jung. Let's get these published too by Bollingen. But when Joe started to look at that, he read all the yearbooks and he said, "This won't work." He said, this. He said, and they said, "Well, what?" And he said, "I think you can get a." He said, I could draw a number of papers around a theme, like time and eternity. And he said, but they'd come from different places. And so he did one volume, and then another, and then another, and then another. And he did 6 altogether. In fact, sort of, this is, we have recently consigned Joseph Campbell's papers and notes and material to New York Public Library. This won't be publicly announced for a couple of months yet. But one of the real treasures there are all of the papers that were delivered that he read. And you can see his marginalia. So sometimes you'll see him say, "This is crap," or, "Oh, I'd like to hear more about this," or, and he read them all in their original language. If they were French, he read them in French, and his notes are in French. And if they were in German, he read it in German, and his notes are in German. Wow. Okay, and so from this thorough reading, he pulled the one book, then the next, and the next. And it's also, I mean, the marginalia and stuff. This is one of the Q&As here at Esalen. As his later years, and I wish I could tell you exactly where. I know it's on one of the collected works that we're releasing. Somebody says, "Mr. Campbell, you're elevated thought and so enlightened, and do you have a meditation practice?" And he said, "Absolutely." And they said, "Could you share it?" And he said, "Certainly. I underline sentences in books."
That's beautiful.
And that's what he did.
Yeah.
Later on in the same thing, they said, "Well." A similar question, so do you have a special diet? And he said, "I certainly do. It's the Glenlivet and rare roast beef." and then, of course, there's this audible, and then he goes on a little riff about, the carrots didn't run away from you? You didn't hear the lettuce scream? And then he goes into his thing, life lives on life.
Yeah.
And that's the basic fact of which all of our struggles with mythology and all of our attempts to explain begin with an awareness of death and an awakening of awe. Something that gobsmacks us. It's so awesome. It's harder and harder to find that these days.
Yes.
But without that sense of wonder and awe, life becomes flat and without meaning.
We have arrived at the fourth chakra. It is at the level of the heart, and its name is Anahata. And that, freely translated, or rather amply translated, means the sound that is not made by two things hitting together. Now, what would that sound be? You've all heard the Zen query. What is the sound of one hand? The sound that is not, all the sounds that we hear are made by two things striking together. My voice is the wind striking the larynx cords. The sound that is not made by two things striking together is the sound of the energy of the universe, out of which all things are precipitations. It is antecedent to things. And that sound, guess what? All you have to do is cover your ears and you'll hear it. It's Om.
How great was Campbell's sense of himself in terms of, was he aware that he was an important intellectual, or was there, what would you say personally his character was? A playfulness, a seriousness?
A deep inquisitiveness, a deep interest. He rigorously scheduled his time because he could be so easily enraptured by, he'd go out to have with somebody maybe for lunch and ask him a bit about what they're doing, and 3 hours or 4 hours would be going by as he's just enthralled by what he's learning, and it was constantly like that. Did he have this sense? No. There was a moment, and this is maybe a good insight into his character. He started working on this atlas in 75. I came on in 78, 79. It's now 81, 82. I mean, we've been working on this thing, and it's growing and growing and growing, and all of our resources are in it, and nobody's interested. We soldiered on, He gave his advance back because we did it on our own. And there was a day when I said to him, "Hey, question, do you ever get discouraged?" And he said, "Well, I'm human, of course. I get discouraged." "Well, why?" And I said, "Well, I'm pretty damn discouraged right now. And, and I'm not quite sure what to do about it." And he said, "Well, that's a human response." And he said, "All I can say is that, you have to tell yourself," he said, "you have to keep your eye focused on the work. And you have to tell yourself that if the work positively impacts one person's life, it will have been worth it." And that's what he did. I mean, he used over and over, "It's not about me, it's about the work. It's not autobiography, it's not about me, it's the work." And he persisted in that. And the work was not just his own. The work was this humankind's one great story. So almost anything that came at him, he would find it would resonate with some part of this. I mean, when in his journals, when he's like 25 and 30, he talks about wanting to create an outline of everything that would contain Play-Doh and toothbrushes. So he's look at sort of almost like a glass bead game. There's a bit of Hesse there. It just, everything does relate to everything else. So how do I put it together? And that's also why this work continued to expand.
Yeah.
It grew because the world is constantly expanding, and no matter how you try to compartmentalize it, it wants to grow on you. And so his focus was on the work and on, all those years at Sarah Lawrence, he used to say, I learned early on that it was my job to help these young women see how these things are important in their lives. It's not just an academic exercise. If they don't see the importance of it in their own life, then I failed.
With the people who come to your workshop that you lead, what is the attraction of Campbell's philosophy? What are they finding useful and relevant in it?
Well, that's a bit of a loaded question, because it's between what they think they're going to find and what they actually get.
Okay, so let's start with what do they think they're coming for?
I think they think they're coming for a couple of things. I think they're coming, first of all, to be in to have the experience of being with people who have some understanding of the things that matter to them. As we had these sort of introductions this morning, lots of people talk about The Hero with 1,000 Faces, how it helped them psychologically, or they're filmmakers and how they came upon it, or they're artists, or so they most, but not all. I mean, we always get a few who will confess midweek when we give them the opportunity that, I didn't know a thing about Joseph Campbell when I came here. I just knew I had to pick a workshop if I wanted to come, and this seemed the least threatening. So I think they think they're coming in part to have high-level intellectual conversations, and they certainly do in the dining room, not in the workshop session. It's experiential. And what I'm trying to do with the workshop is give them an opportunity to experience in their own lives how they make and live into their own myths, their own truths. There's a certain amount of so it's mythogenesis, but that also means that you have to demythologize certain things in order to make space for other things to have that import.
What does it mean to demythologize?
Well, for example, mythology, and on some other level, is this multi-level belief system into which you've grown. It's a little harder for us to see that now, but imagine for a minute you lived in the Renaissance, or you lived in an Amazonian tribe. Everything you did, everything you heard, everything you said, all your ceremonies, all your stories, everything reflected one big story that everybody there bought into, okay? We all grow up with remnants of those. Campbell calls it a terminal moraine of mythic symbols, fragments of mythic symbols and images that once gave rise to whole civilizations. Most or many of us are born into traditions, even if it's not religious, it's secular. The myth of American exceptionalism, or you can run down any of these belief systems that we have picked up along the way, or this idea of what success actually means. There comes a point where we all sort of look at these things and we have to make a distinction between what we really truly do believe, because that's our experience, and what we have been told we believe because that's someone else's experience, which they have generally provided us with the best of intentions. This is how they get through the dark night of the soul. If it doesn't work for us, we have to demythologize it. We can't get rid of it, but we have to be able to say, I understand where that came from, and that's a really wonderful idea that my father had, and I understand why my mom said that. But in my life, here's what I'm seeing. Okay, so I'm demythologizing the stories and the narratives that I have come up with in order to have the space to create my own story.
What was it that it seemed like it became a tradition for Campbell to celebrate his birthday at Esalen towards the end of his life? Or what was the birthday celebration like?
It was different. It was always different. But those last 10 years, he was he was doing that week with Al Wang, Sung Liang Al Wang. So that's a great example, because in the beginning there were the Wang Tai Chi groupies and there were the Campbell groupies, and Joe would lecture and all the Tai Chi people get up and leave the room, and then Al get everybody on their feet, and then all the people who were there to hear Campbell lecture either would just sit there or they'd leave the room. And I guess, as it's been told to me, after a couple of years, they started doing little things to try to figure out. So Joe would start a lecture and say, Al, you've heard this 5 times. You give the lecture.
Yeah.
And then he'd say, Joe, we're going to dance Shiva. Show us how to dance Shiva. So, again, this conscious attempt. And this is another really good, the more I've, done workshops and things and so on, I become really, really conscious of the people who play well with others and the ones who don't, and I love it when I can get collaborators who are going to juice me in a way that, I wouldn't. And a lot of Joe's stuff here at Esalen over the years, he would team up with people. And so we have these wonderful, colloquies between different folks. And you can see, if you listen to any of those tapes, a bunch of which are here, a lot of which are in our archive as well, you hear, you get a sense of his curiosity. You get a sense of how he picks up things that someone else has given him and how he gives something back. And so, and it doesn't always work like that. But if you set that out as what your goal is, we were kind of talking about it coming up here. It's a thing that I think is great about Esalen, and a thing that's so easily overlooked. I've always, when Brother David was here, he came in every Thursday. I loved to go out and get, I'll get Danny B to come in at one point and talk about the history and talk about that's what you can do here. And it happens no matter how you do it. I've got people in my group this year from Latin America, from Brazil, from Argentina, from Japan, from the UK, and people who grew up in Seattle and then moved to Japan, and from all over. And when this starts to unfold, and you start to and then this sort of interaction starts to happen where. And it does, it's just, in my case, I just try to trigger it in the session and hope it will spill out to the rest of the time there, because where else do you have that opportunity? We don't, we just don't, out in that world.
Here's a wonderful meditation. Go someplace where there's a good echo and you're quite alone, and shout some of the worst things at yourself. Call yourself everything terrible. And you'll respond as it comes back. You'll think, he's saying things like that about me. And then you will realize that all talk is just echo like that and no more important than that.
You must have spent the afternoon with Fritz.
What do you think, as we kind of bring this towards an ending place, what do you think is a good way for people who are curious about Campbell but don't have that much knowledge about him to explore his work?
There's a few points of entry. Immediate entry into the material. I often advise people to take a look at the book called Myths to Live By, which are a series of chapters, several of them drawn from early lectures in the 60s here, and also drawn from these lectures he did at Cooper Union, 1 hour. These clips and things you're playing, I think it's interesting to note. Joe did not use notes. What you are hearing is him speaking extemporaneously. When he did these lectures at Cooper Union, they were to be 1 hour long. They are, the tapes are 59:30, 59:02. And they don't seem truncated. So Myths to Live By, he touches on a whole range in historical development, to the relationship between mythology and psychology, between schizophrenia and mysticism, the spacewalk. So it really gives a sweep of a lot of his ideas. Any of his lectures are very accessible. The foundation has, what we did is we had after he died, we gathered about 1,400 discrete lectures. Some of them were so old they were on wire spools, and some were on a reel-to-reel where we could go one time through the tape head, and then we had emulsion, and that was it. And so we digitized for years, and we've released over the years now. We're coming up 80 discrete lectures. So we did series 1, which were what we considered the best of his lectures from the 60s and into the 70s, and they're in volumes, so they're themed. There'd be 5 lectures in each volume, and then series 2, one volume in series 2 has 11 in it, and one has 6, but mostly it's 5. And those are the middle years, and we're now into series 3, which includes the later years, late 70s and early 80s. You can go on the website, Joseph Campbell website, foundation website, jcf.org, and you can see them all. You can sample an individual lecture. Eventually, when we finish series 3, we'll be putting all of the stuff we have up online. Even though some of it is, the audio quality is not so great, and in others, there's a better example of him talking on that. But if somebody really wants to do it, that's one. And another way into it, I think, is in this funny kind of way, is third party. We'll be showing tonight, for example, in my workshop, a film called Finding Joe, which was made by a filmmaker named Pat Solomon. Now, Pat's taken Joe's work and he's done this documentary. And we'll also be showing something called Mythic Journeys from an event of his centenary. So these are people who are, these are examples of people who are working with Campbell's work, but it's very transparent. I mean, Campbell's quoted all over the place and you can see what it is, but it gives you a framework to go into it. Or, even if you're to read, some of the things like manuals on screenwriting and things like this, if that's your passion, you're going to find Campbell all over this. Or gaming, good golly, I was on a panel with myself and 8 guys who between them had like 350 years of video game design. And to a person, they all said, oh, yeah, we all use the hero's journey. I mean, we don't follow it. Wow. It's not like a map because, but we start out, we know this. And he said, and we go with our story and then we hit a place where we're kind of don't know which way to go. And he said, then we'll drag out the hero's journey again. And we'll take a look and we'll go, oh, here's where we are. Well, this might be the way to do it. So, you can see it. Or, look at when Power of Myth aired, there was no place. Myth was a subset of things. So the third week of Power of Myth airing in New York, Barnes & Noble bookstore on Broadway had dragged out an 8-foot table, hand-lettered sign, Myth. And they put all manner of stuff on there, anything they could think. Now, if you go into one of the remaining bookstores, you'll see a whole subject of myth. Yeah. You now can go places and actually get a degree in myth, and we're responsible for that. You now, you can't turn on the television without seeing, Marvel Super Agents or, Percy Jackson and Lightning Guy, Percy Jackson and it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere now, and some of it is really rich and nuanced, and some of it's, appropriate for the audience it's aimed at. But this is another way in, because if you start to look at this stuff, then when you start to pick up, if you pick up The Hero with 1,000 Faces, or you pick up one of the George Miller or George Lucas or Richard Adams or someone like that talking about the impact of Campbell on their work, you suddenly can see it because you've seen the example of it. It's not theoretical anymore. So those are the ways in. I think eventually, if you get your toe in the water, you're going to want to read The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And as many people in our workshop have said, it may sit on your shelf for 10 years unread, or you may read one chapter and then go, oh my God, and not pick it up again for another one. Or sometimes you'll sit down and you read it all the way through and you'll realize you think you got half of it and you'll read it again. But I think that's certainly a piece that should be read, but it's not necessarily the easiest first point of entry for people. It's certainly the most famous. Mm-hmm. I mean, Time magazine calls it one of the 100 most influential books of the 20th century. Almost 50 years after it was written, it was on the New York Times bestseller list. It's now in 27 languages and several million copies around the world. So it's had a huge impact. And watch, if you can get your hands on The Power of Myth, Joseph Campbell and The Power of Myth, you'll be enthralled. An awful lot of people. That's why that program is the most successful PBS show ever. It's raised more money for PBS than any other show they've had, at least up until Ken Burns. And it's it's truly impacted a whole lot of people's lives. And you really get a sense of Joe as I knew and loved him. I mean, very much there, very much immediately engaged with Bill. It's very much a conversation. You can see the dynamic, and you can see the man in action. So I think that's also a great place of entry.
Bob Walter, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, Sam, it's been my pleasure. It's always great to be here at Esalen and be in a place where you can have these kind of conversations.
Thank you for listening to Voices of Esalen. Today's show is produced in conjunction with Cheryl Frenzel, Geraldine Hess, Lori Putnam, Shannon Hudson, and Ian Golden. Our music is by Nico Holloman. If you'd like to hear more episodes, please find us on iTunes, and if you like what you're hearing, take a second to rate us and write a review. You can also find all of our episodes at esalen.org. That's ESALEN.org. Until next time, be well.